The National Museum of Women in the Arts in Washington, D.C. has reopened after a breathtaking top-to-bottom renovation. And we're celebrating the voices and achievements of women artists from around the world. Visit now to see Suchitra Matai, Myth from Matter, a new exhibition of richly layered and vibrant paintings, sculptures, and installations that use saris, vintage needlepoints, jewelry, and bindis to imagine a past that lifts up women and people of color. Tickets at nmwa.org. That's nmwa.org.
Today on CityCast DC, as you may have noticed, DC has a lot of empty storefronts. Who's to blame? Well, unless you are a weird person who never shops online, you are, partly. Leah Brooks studies urban space at George Washington University, and she's here to talk about how things got this way and what the city ought to do next. Today is Thursday, October 3rd. I'm Michael Schaefer, and here's what DC is talking about. Hey, Leah.
Hi, Mike.
Thanks for being here.
It's my pleasure.
So anyone who's been downtown, in the last few years has noticed that there is a bunch of unoccupied retail space, and it's been that way for a while. What is going on down there?
Well, Mike, I want to say, A, it's sad for right now, but B, it's not just immediately sad. You should be a long run kind of sad, because the retail space has been on a long, slow decline since about, the mid-aughts.
Right. And I noticed at some point that in downtown, you've got your lunch places with or without sneeze guard. But, as far as like buying clothes and stuff, much of the places are like Nordstrom Rack. That is where they've got a special like discount model that's not really replicated online. The old days of just like storefront retail, like clothing stores and stuff have really dissipated long before COVID.
Oh, absolutely. I think even long before COVID, you saw this switch from all these things you used to buy that you don't really buy much anymore, like newspapers. I work at GW, and there was a mall near GW, an indoor mall, and it used to have a really fantastic international newsstand, newspapers from all over the world. That's gone. It had all kinds of other services that people used to buy. They don't buy anymore. So I would say that was like this long, slow decline that then got hit by this huge hammer during COVID, bang, that worsened the long, slow decline. You got even more retail vacancies.
So your research into this paper references 7 metro areas, including DC. Where do we stand in the continuum of cities you researched?
In general, it seems like DC is maybe a little worse, but not hugely worse. So we have one part of the paper where we look at how retail rents have fared over the long run. Retail rents in DC have been slowly declining over the last 20 years. And that's like most cities in the U.S., most of the major cities we look at in the paper, but maybe a little worse in DC.
Wait, so before we get ahead of ourselves, how do you define retail?
So in this paper, we don't have a lot of options. We buy data from a vendor, and the vendor who collects data on commercial properties defines retail. What we try to do is things that consumers buy in person. It's not just the clothes you buy at TJ Maxx, but it's also the food you buy at the store, when you go to CVS, or when you get your shoes shined.
What about like dental services?
No.
Okay. So it means basically anything you can walk into like without an appointment and buy stuff.
Yeah, I think so. I think we would still count probably a massage, but not the dentist.
Got it. Tell me how this is affecting DC specifically. This is a city that has had, particularly on the west side of downtown, a kind of very Office Canyon-y downtown. Not a lot of people living there. There's talk of trying to change that. But for the time being, after dark, there's not a whole lot going on.
Yeah, DC's hurting. And first, I think DC faced all the same things as major U.S. cities, these big long-run trends working away from in-person retail. And then the pandemic hit downtown DC much harder than other cities. And, not the worst, but probably, like the bottom 25%. And I think a reasonable expectation has to be, now that we're 4 years after the pandemic, that we're not going to get back to that level of people downtown. Probably not in the next decade, maybe not in the next 2 decades, which means that something has to give somewhere.
Other than, snapping our fingers and ordering people to start hanging out downtown in ways they never did even in the old days, are there laws and regulations that are, either making things worse or making things seem more gloomy?
So one thing Rachel Meltzer, my co-author, who's an urban planning professor at Harvard, one thing Rachel and I see in this paper, which we see for New York and LA, we just can't say for the other cities because we don't have the data, is this pretty striking fact that retail rents are declining. However, and retail spaces are getting smaller over time. So that's the first thing. Lower rents and smaller spaces, because places know that you can order online. So the things they want to stock things that are complements to what you order online, not a substitute for what you order online. But at the same time, the amount of retail space, at least in New York and Los Angeles, which is the amount of space that cities zone for retail, cities say this space can only be occupied by a retailer, that amount of space is growing. And that makes us nervous.
So basically, there are rules that say, hey, if you put up an office building here on this street, the ground floor has to be retail.
Yes, and cities have a good reason for telling developers that they should put retail on the ground floor. And it's a kind of like urban planning orthodoxy that cities are better served when their streets are vibrant. And one good way to make vibrant streets is to have retailers on the street. And I think that's right. I don't think those planners are wrong. I think probably when you walk around downtown, you prefer a street that has more retail on it than less. It's just more fun and more interesting and probably more safe. But all that said, you're probably better off with a street that doesn't have retail than a street that has empty retail.
This is an irony in your research here, which is that the mayor of the city and the powers that be have announced this idea of turning downtown into a livable area again, with apartments and parks and kids and stuff. And when you close your eyes and you think of a vibrant living downtown, you think of stores, you think of people popping in and out of cafes or going out to get groceries. But what you are calling for is for the city to actually reduce the amount of pressure and obligation to have retail space in the downtown core.
So I agree with you, but I don't think it's actually as odd a fit as it seems. Because if you think about a big office building that you convert into a residential building, the office building probably has 10 times the occupancy of people as the residential building. So the office building is going to drive a lot more retail traffic during the day than a same size residential building, which means that even if you repurpose some office buildings into residential buildings, you're not going to get enough people to get us back to the level of pre-pandemic downtown foot traffic.
Let's be real, lawsuits are not fun, but with Paulson and Nace, at least they're a little easier. Paulson and Nace is a DC law firm in every sense of the word. It was founded here in 1979. Partner Chris Nace is a local who cares deeply about the DC community, even serving on the board of the local branch of the Living Classrooms Foundation in his free time. Nace and his associates Samantha Peters and Maya Perry handle medical malpractice, wrongful death, and other complex injury cases. And they don't just settle every case. They'll go to court. They'll fight for you. Paulson and Nace has even been recognized as one of U.S. News' best law firms. So if you have been hurt or lost a loved one because of someone else's mistake or negligence, call Paulson and Nace for a no-obligation consultation. Visit www.paulsonandnace.com. That's PAULSONANDNACE.com. Or call 202-463-1999.
The National Museum of Women in the Arts in Washington, D.C. has reopened after a breathtaking top-to-bottom renovation. And we're celebrating the voices and achievements of women artists from around the world. Visit now to see Suchitra Matai, Myth from Matter, a new exhibition of richly layered and vibrant paintings, sculptures, and installations that use saris, vintage needlepoints, jewelry, and bindis to imagine a past that lifts up women and people of color. Tickets at nmwa.org. That's nmwa.org.
So I'm nerdy for this stuff, as you are too, because you've made a career of it. But can you explain, for people who don't spend their days thinking about land use, why should regular DC residents care about this research you're doing? Because it seems pretty important to me.
Well, first, everyone should be excited about economics, just because. But then second of all...
That's an order.
That's an order, of course. But then second of all, regular DC residents should care because businesses pay property taxes. And property taxes, fund things that DC residents care about. And I think DC residents should also care because vacant spaces are bad for cities. They're not just bad for the landowner that owns them. I mean, that's sad for him, but that's not really why we care about it. They're bad for all the businesses that would want to locate nearby, and that makes them bad for the city as a whole. They're bad for the property tax revenues of the structures and the businesses that are nearby the vacant building. And I think in the long run, DC residents should want people to come to DC. DC stock and trade is to get people to come here to do all the things we do in DC that's special and different from the rest of the country. And making people want to come to DC to spend their convention dollars instead of, for example, into Arlington or Alexandria depends on us having a vibrant and attractive city center.
All right. So word is that, people may not be going into downtown stores, but it's not like downtown offices are all that popular either. If a landlord is allowed to take a space out of retail use, what do you think they'll use it for?
So I think this is the most difficult part of the question, because I think part of the answer has to be we need less retail space. So then the question is, what do you do with the retail space? One thing we need a lot of in DC is housing. It's not clear to me that from the landowner perspective, it's easy to change your retail unit into a housing unit. I think that clever artists and clever urban planners can think of ways to repurpose those spaces. The city could give landlords more flexibility in what they're allowed to do with those spaces. I know that the city has been trying to allow for greater temporary occupancy of structures, I think without huge success, but allowing for temporary occupancy of retail spaces for different kinds of needs, perhaps seasonal needs, in ways that would fill up the spaces, or just take them out of the zoning, out of the retail stock entirely by letting them be ground floor office space, or by letting them become part of the office part of the building instead of the retail part of the building.
I mean, isn't this also sort of an argument against doing zoning, period? I mean, if what you're saying is that regulators, people who write the rules, cannot see around corners about how we're going to change the way we live and work and shop and play, and the best thing to do is let the people who actually have got some skin in the game figure out what to do with the space, maybe not write the rules at all?
I don't want to say no rules because zoning serves useful purposes. Like, you don't want to live next to a gas station. I don't want to live next to a gas station. And zoning helps us believe that the property you buy today is not going to be next to a gas station tomorrow. And that's a valuable and useful purpose of land use regulation. So I don't want to say that there's no role for land use regulation, but I think there's certainly a lot of scope for planners to give developers in this part of the city or landowners in this part of the city a lot more flexibility in how they use their space.
There are some cities in America that have either no zoning or much less zoning. Like if you go to Houston or something, you'll go along the street and it'll be like fancy French restaurant, Jiffy Lube, strip club, preschool, TJ Maxx, and it's all right there. Is there any sense that places that have that kind of setup have been able to recover or deal with the interruption of either the pandemic or the move to online retail faster than places like Washington that have more elaborate zoning?
Mike, that's a great question. I don't think anyone has answered it with data, but we do know that those places with less restriction on land use are more likely to build more housing when housing demand increases. That part is true. Like, we know that in Texas, when people move to Texas, the housing supply responds. And Texas is known for having sort of less restrictive zoning, and Houston in particular, even less restrictive zoning than that. But I don't think, to the best of my knowledge, I don't think anyone has answered that question with data, the question about retail land use in particular.
So have there been moves in D.C.? I mean, obviously, it's not a secret. The city is pretty freaked out about the state of the office market and the state of downtown retail. They're very high on retail and in other neighborhoods. What have been the moves to fix it?
You're right. The city's super worried. And I think they're right to be worried. I don't think that concern is misplaced. The city has been offering some subsidies to get people into retail spots. That strikes me in the long run as not a policy that's going to serve the city well. Because if the problem is that we have too much retail space, paying people to go into the retail space that we have in a way that they're not going to be able to maintain in the long run is a loser for the city. If the city thinks, okay, we can get people into these retail spaces and it's just a matter of these particular corridors need a jump start. And once we get one tenant in, we'll be able to attract other tenants. I think that's what subsidies can do well. It's not clear to me that that's what subsidies are going to do to our downtown in DC, when it seems like the case is more that there are just many, many, many fewer people going to businesses in downtown DC. We don't want to keep retail rents high by giving people subsidies, because that's just pushing off into the future the time at which these landlords are going to have to adjust. So the city has been giving subsidies. I don't know if the city has been trying to just move space out of retail use and into other uses, which I think is the long run solution here.
I mean, you talk to people about what they're excited about, and they talk about like pop-up galleries and stuff, which seems cool, but like probably not something you can count on for an
You
economic
can't have
future.
1,000 pop-up galleries.
I mean, you can. You just can't make money from it.
I don't know. When I moved to DC, I was a research assistant in DC in 1998, and I worked near the 7th Street corridor before it was entirely redeveloped. And there were a bunch of galleries on 7th Street. And I think it was a great temporary solution to a place that was likely, like you could have prospects that the neighborhood was going to look better in the future than it did now. And you needed some kind of temporary gap filling for those spaces, and they weren't too valuable to the landlords, so the landlords are willing to accept pretty low rents for these galleries that moved in. And then, as the neighborhood trended more expensive, landowners kicked out the galleries and filled them with tenants who were willing to pay more rent. So I think it's a solution in a small neighborhood. I just don't see it as a all-around downtown solution, but I think it could be a good solution in a few places.
Leah, thank you so much for being here.
Mike, thanks for having me.
And that is all for today here on CityCast DC. If you enjoyed the show, why not tell a friend, rate the show, leave us a review, and subscribe to our morning newsletter. We'll be back tomorrow morning with more news from around the city. Bye.